Hey, if we've never met, my name's Clint, and today I'm wrapping up a series we've been doing over December called Reasons for the Season. And it's a bit of a play on words, because you might have seen the stickers, or you might have seen people post about this idea that Jesus is the reason for the season. Yeah, I think if we were to talk to Jesus, if we were to read through the New Testament, we'd actually realize that Jesus isn't so much the reason for the season as you and I are the reason for the season. See, Jesus came because of your and I's dysfunction, because of our mess, because of our sin. If we didn't sin, if we didn't mess things up just a little bit, there'd be no need for Jesus. And so while I understand the theory and why people say, hey, Jesus is the reason for the season, the truth is you and I, humanity, we are the reason for the season. And then when we started the series, we said the first reason for the season, the first reason that Jesus came was to bless the world. Then the second week, we talked about the idea that Jesus came is to demonstrate what God is like. If we want to know what God is truly like, we need to look at Jesus. And then today, here's just a little bit of a warning. If you came along today for a good little pick-me-up, for a little bit of like, oh, let's have an exciting talk about Christmas, that's just going to give me a little bit more energy, I'm not quite going to give that to you today, because I generally feel what we're going to talk about today could be the most confronting, could be the most convicting, and could be the most challenging talk that we've had almost all year, depending on what's going on in your world right now. And while it can be very challenging and very convicting, I'm not apologizing for that, because it could also be the most beneficial, it could be the most helpful, it could be the most life-changing for us. Because what we're going to talk about today is one of the reasons that Jesus came, is to remove our excuses. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. When Matthew was writing the Christmas story, one of the most famous verses in the Christmas story says this, right? The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel. Anybody know what Emmanuel means? God with us, right? God with us. And what's really interesting about when God gave someone a name, or when God changed someone's name, it essentially was there to foreshadow that person's purpose in life. Where we saw him change Abram to Abraham. We saw him change Peter's name from Simon to Peter. And so when God gives someone a name, it very much is there to say, hey, this is her purpose in life. And God's saying, hey, a virgin's they're going to have a son. He is to be called Emmanuel, or they will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And this is really powerful, because remember the reason Jesus had to come, as I said before, was because you and I were falling short of God's standards, because we've messed things up a little bit, because of our insecurities, because of our dysfunction. You could almost say because of our sin, is the way you'd say it, like theologically, right? That Jesus had to come, that when it comes to Christians, when it comes to humanity, man, there's this level of dysfunction. And it plays out in terms of our relationship with God, but it plays out in terms of our relationship with one another, right? Like how many of us, like, don't put your hands up, but how many of us have got some interesting relational things going on in our world because of dysfunction, because of insecurity, because of sin? I think all of us could put our hands up here. How many of us have got ourselves into a place where it's really, really hard to describe the relationship? And sometimes this comes out strongest, and the emotions of this come out strongest at Christmas, because it's a time when people normally gather, but maybe you're part of a family that can't get together the way you used to get together because of some sort of dysfunction, because of some sort of sin, because of some sort of insecurity, and now there's fractions of the family that you used to get together and now you can't get together. And if we were to ask you to explain the situation, you might pause for a moment and you'd probably say, well, it's just complicated, right? Yeah? Even Facebook's adopt this technology, right? When you go online and you see someone's relationship status and it just says it's complicated. Yeah? If you see someone who's got that as their relationship status, do not pursue a relationship with that person. Just word of advice. If that's your relationship status at the moment, I'm sorry. But just avoid that, right? It's complicated. But that's what we'd say, right? We'd say, you just can't get that part of the family, that part of the family together because, it's just complicated. Like, I can't invite those friends around and those friends around because it's complicated. We have to see her in the morning and him at night because it's right, complicated. And we can laugh, but the reality is this is true. And it hurts. And it's difficult. And some of us, we can rewind the clock and think this is what Christmas was like, and now this is what Christmas is like. And in some cases, we've got so accustomed to this is how Christmas is now, that it's like this is just the way that things are, and there's nothing we can do about it. And what's really, really interesting, and an author called Philip Yancey, he wrote this, and I think it's absolutely fascinating because it talks about, especially for us who are Christians, and here's just a little side note. If you're here today and you'd say, yeah, I'm a follower of Jesus, then what we're talking about today, like, I don't think it's optional for us. I don't think it's like, I might do that. I think if we take our faith seriously, what I'm going to talk about today and what I'm going to suggest and put to you today is like, this is going to be difficult, but I have to do it. If you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, you can just like go, Christians, good luck. That's a reason why I'm never going to be a follower of Jesus if that's what it's going to require of me. But here's what I think is true as well. Is even when you hear what I'm going to say, even when everything inside you says, I don't want to do that, I think there's a part in the core of you that says, no, that is actually what I desire more than anything else. And so I'll just leave that with you. But Philip Yancey says this, talking about the relational tension that can happen among Christians. He says, Christians get very angry toward other Christians who sin differently than they do. You've seen this play out, right? Christians get very angry towards other Christians who sin differently than they do. You see a group of Christians sitting around pointing fingers at them, judging them, saying, why are they doing that? What's going on there? What's going on there? Well, we see this play out, and you hear stories of Christians picketing something, and you're like, they're just pointing fingers at people. And it's just heartbreaking and devastating. And if you're not a Christian, you knew this, right? And you're like, that's one of the reasons I don't want to be one of you guys. Because I've seen this, and it's like, eh. And it's nice for you to know that some of us realize this about ourselves, right? That Christians get very angry towards other Christians who sin differently than they do. But no matter who you are, you often probably get very angry towards groups of people that do things differently than you do, who think differently than you do, who behave differently than you do, who value things differently than you do. And what's interesting about this was when Jesus was here, and this just brings back to the Christian context, when Jesus was here, who was the people group that Jesus got the most upset with? He didn't go and get upset and get angry and point fingers at people who were sinners. In fact, the biggest sinners in society were the people that Jesus went and sat with and had lunch with and hang out with and told stories to and spent time with. The people that Jesus got the most frustrated with were the self-righteous. In particular, and sorry men, but it was the male self-righteous people, wasn't it? That would sit there and judge and look down on everyone else. Those are the people that Jesus got mad at. And yet, oftentimes, when it comes to us and the way we live our life, when we look at why there's oftentimes relational tension there, it's because we are self-righteous. We think we're better than, we look down on, we point fingers at other people because they're sinning differently than we are, because their dysfunction is different than ours. And what's remarkable about this is that oftentimes we find it so much easier to get really mad, to get really angry, to get frustrated, to get to the point where we want to take action because of someone else's sin. Yet we're often about our own sin. Do you find that interesting? That we can often get more angry about the way that someone else is sinning than we can about the way that I'm sinning. I can get so angry and mad because of what you're doing or because of what they're doing. Yet there's the sin in my world that I'm just like, well, it's just the way that it is. I'm trying my best, but is this landing? You quiet because this is real? You quiet because silly? That's what we tend to do, right? You see, what happens, the self-righteous, those of us who are self-righteous, we lack self-awareness. I heard it said this way: the more aware I am of the things God has yet to change in me, the more I'm aware of how much God has still got to change me, the less offended and uncomfortable I should be with what God has yet to change in you. See, the more I'm aware and the more I'm mad at and the more I'm like, just got this awareness of what God's got to change in me, then, man, what God's got to change in you doesn't worry me so much. Because I realize, man, how much He's still got to change in me, so what He's got to change in you doesn't really matter. But when I'm not aware of how much God has still got to change in me, of how much He's still got to grow me, of how much He's still got to change me, of how much He's still got to conform me into His image, when I'm not aware of that stuff, I find it so easy to get angry, to be uncomfortable around you because I know what He's got to change in you. And when it comes to our relational breakdowns, when it comes to the challenges that we might see in those situations that we'd describe as, what was the word I used before? As complicated. The reality is, right, they're not actually as complicated as they are uncomfortable, yeah? A lot of the times we like to say, it's complicated, so we don't have to sort of delve into it or face it. But the truth is, while there might be some complications there, and decisions that have been made, the reality is that the reason we avoid it, the reason we don't do anything with it, isn't because it's complicated, but rather because it's uncomfortable. And if I have to go and talk with him, and if I have them in the room and them in the room, who knows how this is going to go? It's just, it's not so much uncomfortable, is it? It's not so much complicated, it's uncomfortable. And here's where Christmas removes our excuses. It removes our excuses because Christmas shatters those excuses for avoiding complicated and uncomfortable. We've got to understand, if Jesus was willing to step out of heaven and come to earth, despite your dysfunction, despite my dysfunction, despite your mess, despite my mess, if He was willing to come and stay, doesn't that highlight what we are supposed to do too? How uncomfortable do you think it was for a perfect God, a holy God, to step out of heaven and come to earth and embrace the mess? Yet He stayed in the mess. John, talking about Jesus coming, he says this in John chapter 1. He says, the Word became flesh. God became flesh. And then he continues. And this is, tell me if this is what he says, right? You might get this, but the Word became flesh and saw how messed up, how different we were, and gapped it. Doesn't say that, right? The Word became flesh. He was polite, nice, stayed around just long enough to not be rude, and then quietly removed himself from the picture. It doesn't say that. It said the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That the perfect God made himself flesh and didn't come and get put off by the uncomfortable, didn't come and get put off by the complicated, didn't come and turn his back on us, but he came and made his dwelling among us. Because he's Emmanuel, God with us. See, as uncomfortable as it was, Jesus was comfortable among humanity. And this is what we say oftentimes, right? That Jesus liked, Jesus embraced people who were nothing like him. And the people who were nothing like him genuinely liked him. That's challenging. Because if I'm honest, if you're honest, there's environments you go into where it's uncomfortable. And when we go into some of these environments where it's uncomfortable, and it's not necessarily uncomfortable because of sin or because there's messed up relational things, it's just like, I just find it awkward in that environment. I just find people that are like, I just struggle in that environment. And you're mature enough, I'm sure. I think I'm mature enough, I'm sure, to sometimes go into these environments and I can be kind and I can be nice and I can introduce myself and I can say a few words and I can engage with a person or three, but if I give another 10 minutes, I can probably make it out the door, right? I've got around and said hi to a number of people. I've had enough conversation. I got a text message, just give me an excuse to walk away. Yet Jesus walked into humanity, came into humanity. And he was comfortable among us. How can I put myself, or how can I make sure when I go to environments where I feel uncomfortable, where things are complicated, that I can remain comfortable? So John said, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And remember then, John's writing this like not when Jesus was born, but after Jesus had died, when he's looking back on Jesus' life and he realizes how amazing Jesus' life was, when he has this picture of who God truly was. And he writes this, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And very next he sees this, and just let this sink in. He says, we have seen his glory. We have seen his glory. This is the same John who saw Jesus dying on the cross and knew it was his responsibility to look after Mary, but was freaking out for his life. This was John who saw him brutally murdered. He says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. And this is what makes Jesus so remarkable. What we tend to do often as people, and you see this oftentimes even in churches, right? You hear about some churches and they say, we're just a truth church. We're going to say whatever needs to be said and doesn't matter how it gets said, because we're here to speak the truth. And as long as we speak the truth, we're being faithful to God, right? And then you can get other churches that say, well, we're all about grace. And we're just all about grace and helping. And we're never going to say something that convicts, and we're never going to say something that's challenging. We're just going to say, it's all right, just keep going. And then what we tend to do is we're like, we don't want to be like that. We don't quite want to be like that. And so we try and take like a measure of truth and a measure of grace and go, how do we have like the right balance of these? How do we hold them in tension? But what was remarkable about Jesus is he was full of grace. And he was full of truth. He was all of one and all of the other. It wasn't, I've got to hold this in tension and I'm leaning too much to this side, I've got to pull it back this way. It's like, no. I'm fully grace. And he was fully truth. And if Jesus was willing, if Jesus was okay with, and he was okay with, stepping out of heaven and coming in to this complicated world that because of dysfunction, because of insecurity, because of sin, there's all this mess, there's all this ick, there's all this and he was willing to come and he was comfortable there. Shouldn't you and I be willing to step out of the safe little world that we try and create for ourselves, where things are comfortable, where, Christians, listen, where you and I are often comfortable even with our sin, and comfortable with our dysfunction, and comfortable with our insecurity, because what we've done is we've justified it, right? Because we just lack the self-awareness to really get angry at what's going on in here. It's easy to get angry at what's going on out there. If Jesus was willing to step into a world and embrace the uncomfortable, then shouldn't you and I be willing to do the same? Shouldn't you and I, no matter how much dysfunction, no matter how much mess, no matter how much sin is there, shouldn't you and I be willing to walk into the mess? Not to say we've got the answers, not to say that we can bring a solution here, but shouldn't we be okay embracing the uncomfortable? Because if our Savior was willing to do that for us, who are we to not do that for others? I heard it said this way once, and I thought it was fantastic, that the distance between, the gap between us and God is way, way bigger than the gap between us and anyone else. And yet God was willing to cover that gap. He asked us to cover this one. See, I think one of the reasons Jesus came was to remove our excuses from walking away from the complicated. He came so that it would remove our excuses to not walk towards the uncomfortable. See, John, he wrote the Gospels known as the Gospel of John, which is the account of Jesus' life. But he also wrote a few letters in the New Testament. And when he wrote one of the letters, which we just, very, very well named, 1 John, the first letter, he said this, he says, we love because. Some of you already know why. Challenging us, I think, right on this point. We love because he first loved us. We love, we go out and embrace the uncomfortable. We love even when it's difficult. We love even when there's dysfunction. We love even when there's sin. We love even when I'm feeling so insecure about this. We love even when they're different. We love even though they don't think like me. We love even when they're different than me. We love, why? Because he first loved us. He met me in my sin. He met me in my mess. He met me with all my trouble, and he didn't turn his back on me. He came and he made his home among us. See, then this is how John would say, or this is what John says. This is how God showed his love, here's the word, among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. It's Christmas. Christmas should remind us more than any other time of the year that God was willing to enter the mess, that he saw it, he knew it was going to be uncomfortable. How uncomfortable was going to the cross? Way more uncomfortable than anything you and I are going to have to do. Okay? He saw how uncomfortable it was, he saw how messy it was, and he walked to it. And John says this, dear friends, since God so loved us, we ought to love one another. Now look, I don't know what situations come to your mind when you like look at that relationship and describe it as complicated. But I'm sure there's some. Some of us, you might have to rewind the clock back enough because we've so normalized it now. It's not complicated. It's kind of just forgotten. But what I want to challenge us with, what I want to encourage us with as we go into this Christmas season, is where there's complication, where there is uncomfortability, what would it look like to walk towards it? Like I said at the start, for those of us who are followers of Christ, we're called to do this. We should love because we understand that He first loved us. We should do what He's done because He's done it for us. So we should be motivated to now go and do it for others. If you're here and you're not a follower of Christ, you're like, sweet, I've got an out, thanks, it's awesome. I don't have to do it. You don't. You're not accountable. But I think somewhere inside you, something's resonating. You're like, I want to, but I'm scared. I want to, but it could get more complicated. I want to, but I don't know what's going to happen. Just do it. Just do it. See, if we look again back to Christ as our model, He came into the mess. He came into the complicated, not knowing what choice we'd make. He came not knowing if it'd be accepted or rejected. In fact, He came knowing He was going to be rejected. He came knowing that the crucifixion was coming. Yet He did it anyway. What would it look like this Christmas season for you and I to take His example and say, hey, Christmas reminds me that I no longer have an excuse to walk away from the complicated. I'm going to walk in and I'm going to embrace the uncomfortable. I think making that decision could be one of the biggest, most powerful decisions you make this year. Let me pray. Thank you so much, Jesus, that when You saw the mess that I was in, the mess that we were in, You decided to enter into it. You embraced what was incredibly uncomfortable because You loved us so much. And Father, I know how easy it is to look at the wrongdoing of others and get mad and angry and yet somehow sit and be okay with and justify the own wrongdoing and sin in my life. I pray You'll help me to never be so self-righteous that I look at others more harshly than I look at myself. I pray for all of us that You'll help us never to be so self-righteous, to lack the self-awareness, that we get more mad at what other people are doing than we get mad at the sin that keeps cropping up and coming up in our lives. And Father, I pray You'll give every person here the wisdom to know what to do with where this has landed for them today. And then I pray that You'll give them the courage to go and do it. I pray this in Jesus' name. And everybody said, Amen.
Thank you, Clint.